Hello, and welcome to the Corporate Results CRI, How to Use Time Collection for Contract Employees. My name is Frank Costa, and I'm going to be presenting this demonstration that was a presentation that I gave at Deltek's Insight in 2014. If you have any questions, please feel free to chime in. Okay, the agenda today is I'm going to introduce myself, give you a little overview about the issue, and go in through different screenshots and different scenarios of how I personally worked on this issue. And I worked on it while I was a controller for a company where we had some issues. So we'll get into that a little bit later. I'll go over the various different scenarios that we went through, the process that we went through, and so on and so forth. So can anybody, are you seeing this, the speaker introduction screen, please? I know that there's a delay. Okay. Just to give you a little background, I've been working with CostPoint and Deltek products for over 10 years now. I've been an independent consultant, and I worked as a controller, and I've used CostPoint as a controller as well as a director of business systems. So I have both a technical and functional aspect of it. I've worked in all various different industries, so I'm pretty familiar with the various different needs and wants of different organizations. And like I said, I've been a user for over 10 years, and it's one of the great things about the Deltek products that I found is the diversity and the flexibility of it all. And so one of the great things that I had was when I was working in the capacity of a controller, I was working for a growing company. And so before time collection came along, I was working for a CRO, clinical research organization. We had doubled our revenue 3 years in a row, so we were growing pretty fast. We started out with 125 employees. We grew to 250 employees in less than a year. And what was going on is we were actually keying in all these invoices for contract employees directly into the AP section and going into labor, the labor portion of AP. So as we started out originally with 40 contract employees, it was taking probably pretty close to a full-time equivalent in order to get all that done on a regular basis. And as we started growing, we grew to over 300 in less than 6 months with a projection of 400 within a year. I knew that I had to do something because it was just basically me and a part-time accountant and a full-time AP person. So as she was keying these things in, I knew that I needed to do something. So I reached out to Deltek, asked them what I could do. They basically said that, you know, I can try to use a preprocessor and so on and so forth, but I decided to try some other stuff. So one of the problems that we had, especially with the contract employees, is the contract employees were getting upset. They were paid 30 days after receipt of their invoice. And because of that, and the reason for that, I mean, is we had to be able to key all them in, get the invoices, get them approved, and do everything for that, and then get the project managers to approve them, get them processed through AP, get them posted. And so we were running into a lot of problems because there were keying errors, month-end close delays because we were trying to get the cost in there. And we had a lot of overtime costs with the employees trying to get the information keyed into the system. And the invoices, which was the big thing, is the contractors were getting really upset that their payments were being delayed because of all the keying that we had to do. So I came up with some options and solutions for the problem. And the first thing that I was thinking about doing is we could use a third party to actually go in there and key in the employees' vouchers. And so by doing that, it would eliminate the time delays. It wouldn't solve the problems with making sure that all the contract employees' invoices were submitted, because, as you know, if you have a contractor working, the accounting department doesn't really know that these people are putting in time until you get an invoice. So it made it really hard for projections and such. And so we were thinking that that issue wouldn't be resolved with option number one. And then we would also have to give the third party access to our system, which I didn't really feel comfortable with. I know some in my consulting travels, I've noticed that there are companies that do actually do this option. And I figured, okay, well, maybe that would be an option, but the company didn't want to do it. We could hire additional staff to keep up with the demand, and that would actually cost the company more money, or we could try to automate the process. And that's when I came up with the idea to actually try to have the contract employees actually key in the timesheets and put them in time collection, and then have them migrate over. Now, one thing about the contract employees, we actually were having them use time collection or time and expense for the expense portion. We just weren't having them use it for the timekeeping side of it. And so we figured that that would eliminate the ability to track the labor costs. As people were putting their timesheets in, they had to do it on a daily basis. So we would know what the labor costs were going to be, because we were going to see it live on a daily basis. And the PMs would be accountable for tracking and making sure that everything was done. We did it through line level approvals. I know a lot of companies don't like to use line level approvals, but in this situation, we used line level approvals. So the tough part came in with the buy-in of the solution, because the way that the CRO worked was we had basically a recruiting, in-house staff recruiting organization that was within the company, and they were the ones recruiting all these contract employees. And so they were against having them key in their own timesheets, because they said, Frank, you're going to have these guys key it into one system and then key it into another system, and I don't think that that's good. And I said, well, you would be surprised. Maybe what you should do is ask some of them, and see how they feel about it. And they were also concerned about the different pay rates, because some of them would get paid a different rate depending on what they used or what task they were performing. So they were concerned about that as well. And they also wanted to know who would be responsible for tracking all this information, because they said, who's going to be the one helping to reconcile this, making sure that, all this stuff agrees and everything was working properly and people were getting paid properly. And, especially if an hourly rate changed, how do we know their hourly rate was changed, and how are you going to be able to account for that? So those were all good, valid questions for them. And so what I did was I came up with like a cost benefit analysis, and I tried to, get everybody to buy into it. And I said, we were originally running with having the 40 people. We were trying to figure out how we were going to, like I said, key in all those other things instead of allocating the time by having the actual contract employee put in there. So the initial reduction of labor time for the department was about 176 hours a month from us not having to key that in. The final reduction that we had was 187 hours a month. And what I did was I put in a little graph on the right-hand side, which you're going to see in some of these slides. We also noticed that there was improved cash flow, because one of the problems that we had was we were paying employees twice a month, and we were paying contract employees once a month. and their payments were supposed to be paid by the last day of each month following the month that they worked, which meant that as we were building up more and more, we were having to pay money out at the end of the month. And as most financial people will know, money usually trickles in around the 10th of the month because of the fact that your billing dates, if you're doing 30 days after, your billing dates are probably going to be due around anywhere from the 7th to the 10th, depending on how quickly you can get your invoices out there. The other thing that we were worried about was the 1099 issue. And so the current way that we were working with the vendors or the contract employees is we would send out a 1099, and we would 1099 them for both their expenses as well as their labor, because we were just getting a flat invoice from them that said labor hours and T&E or expenses. And they would put that in there. They kept their receipts. They were supposed to be reporting them to the IRS. So we did that. And people were complaining every time we went to issue 1099s. They were saying, no, this is not right. This is not right. And so we were running into a lot of problems with that. By having them segregated, we were able to actually resolve that issue. So the 1099 tracking was a lot easier. And we had a lot of reduced calls from the contract employees asking about their invoice payments. With the recruiters, they had less complaints from their contract employees because they weren't getting paid late. They weren't worried about the 30-day wait period, because one of the things that I was proposing is to put them on a semi-monthly schedule as well. So if they did a timesheet ending from the 1st through the 15th, they were paid by the 22nd. And if they did a timesheet for the 16th through the last day of the month, they were getting paid by the 7th of the month. Now, for the employees, we got paid on the 15th and the last day of the month. So basically, we were on real-time payroll, which is unusual in this area, but in North Carolina, that's typical of how people get paid. You get paid to the day that you work, basically. And so once we did that, we were noticing, and we switched them to that semi-monthly schedule. The contract employees were actually happier entering their timesheets because it was fresh in their mind. They were able to track everything, and they didn't really have to worry about an invoice, but we still required them to give us an invoice so that we can double check and make sure that our reconciliations were in tune. But some of the problems that the recruiters had was the payments that we were paying them before, and because of the late payments, people were leaving the organization. And when they found out that we were paying people semi-monthly, it actually helped bring a lot of them back, where they were calling up saying, hey, I understand you guys have got your pay structure, on a regular basis and on a semi-monthly basis. And so we're interested in, put us back on the schedule so that we can be working for you guys again, because it was normal practice for them to get paid on a monthly basis. And of course, then they could also track the utilization of them. Now, for the project managers and billing, the project managers didn't have to worry about a lot of corrections. They had the line level approvals and time collection, so it was very easy for them to know who was charging their projects. They said that they had more visibility to the charges. They didn't have to track down invoices and say, hey, John Doe is calling me wanting to know where his payment is. I could have sworn I sent you the invoice 2 weeks ago, and why hasn't he been paid? That all got eliminated because we had a liability now, and we had a system to track that liability. So we knew that these people needed to be paid. So if an invoice didn't come through, we basically knew that. The billing group was happy because they could produce their bills within days. They didn't have to sit there and crack a whip to the AP department and say, come on, we need you to get all those invoices in so that we could bill for the month. So they didn't have delays. They didn't have to worry about billing corrections because of the timesheets and the workflow of timesheets, where they would enter their time, a project manager would approve it, and it would get processed. And so everything was easier. And they did actually have a major client who required them to do semi-monthly billing. So the semi-monthly billing process was easier as well. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is go through how this was set up in CostPoint and GCS. So I have a couple of screenshots that I'm going to be showing you. I'll give you some of the basics and then show you some of the screenshots of what are there. And at the end of the presentation, I will have some contact information in there. And if you would like, I would be more than happy to send you some additional information if you'd like. Okay, set up CostPoint and GCS. So for the contract employees, you set them up as employees, but for those of you who have done this before, you would just check the box, a contractor box. And what I recommend is to isolate the contract employees from regular employees. So you would put like a C in front of the ID number so that you know that they're contract employees. I've actually helped organizations set this up for subs as well as for contract employees. So if you have an agency or a sub to your contract and you have all these people working, we've set that up too so that they can all be isolated as well. And they started with an S so that they could we actually built in the agency code in the contract number so that we would be able to run reports and know exactly how much is going to be billed, so on and so forth, to make sure that all those payments were paid properly as well to the agencies. When you do check the contract box, you usually get an error message. I put that in there kind of as a guide for people to know that they get that. I also had them isolate everything as much as possible. So I created a separate contract employee timesheet cycle, and that allowed it to go to a different GL account. Now, one of the things that people have said to me in the past, I've heard various different ways of people doing it. A lot of people don't want it in their labor. So then that runs an issue, a big issue actually. But for those who don't mind having it in their labor, because most of them do want it in their labor, just going through labor distribution. As you know, CostPoint only allows you to have one account, clearing account set up. So your projects are charged and then you're credited to this one account. And by running these timesheets in different cycles, excuse me, with putting them in different cycles, what I did was I just had them do a journal entry to move it from the employee payroll clearing to the contract payroll clearing account. And so when you set up, getting back to when you set up the employees, what you can do is, because you need a leave cycle, I just created one, didn't have any kind of processing for it, but just created that, which with a none or an NLV for no leave. And I select everybody as an hourly employee, and I use their hourly consulting rate. And vendors must be set up for contract employees and or their agencies as well, so that the agencies have to be set up and or the contract employees have to be set up. Now, if you do use expense for the contract employees, and that makes it pretty easy because you'll set up the vendor and you'll already have the vendor set up. And a lot of times contract employees actually have, like I said, in the case of Jane or John Doe, you would have them with their name in time collection, but then their vendor would be set up as Doe Incorporated or Doe LLC or something like that. So, and of course you set that up when you're setting up the vendor, what the employee or the contract employee number is, so that that flows through properly. And here's a screenshot of cost point, basically setting up an employee. I put them in as C with the 10,001 as the employee number, check the box, make sure that they're active, so on and so forth. And then here are some other screenshots that I have where I'm showing to make sure, that the timesheet cycle is different, that you have a leave cycle in there. And I also showed the salary details to show that you do enter salary information for them. And then for the time collection defaults, down at the bottom, you see that it's listed as a contract employee. And then I put them in separate labor groups because a lot of times some of these would be charged to a different labor account, GL account. So I would set up the different labor groups for them so that we were able to have the proper account be charged as they come over from time collection into cost point. The next screenshot I have is of GCS. And I basically just showed the different screens that you would use to set up a contract employee for GCS. And then setting it up in time collection. One of the things that I stress on here in red is that you need to request sufficient licenses, and that's the additional cost that you have, which is really nowhere near the amount of cost that you would have if you had individual employees entering this time in cost point, directly into cost point. So you need to make sure that you have your licenses, because you're not charged for a license in cost point, but you are charged for it in time collection. And so here are some additional items that I put. It depends on your business rules. Employee group types and employee groups, and I put down what they are actually for to assign or restrict charges. Recurrence codes, those are for setting up the automatic feeds from cost point into time collection. And then for time collection to actually grab those feeds, you can set them up on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis so that they can automatically accept the export, the security roles, the functional roles, the timesheet schedules, again, to separate the employees from the contract employees. The work schedules I have as optional. I usually just put them to default, but some contract employees or organizations I've found actually do want separate work schedules for those. So again, it depends on your business rules. So I have that in there, and the timesheet class for the hour rules, the paid types, and notifications. Okay, other things to consider, charge trees to limit access. That's one of the things that I did, was made sure that the contract employees, just saw the direct projects. Occasionally, you will have a contract employee who does need to attend a meeting, so on and so forth, which may or may not be charged. It may be a company meeting or something. So I did have an overhead account set up for that so that we could track that. Of course, the utilization reports, we always wanted to make sure that they were as close to 100% as possible for utilization, because they are getting paid by the hour and they are supposed to be working on specific jobs. And then accounts, do you require other labor accounts for contract employees, for pools? The organization I worked with, we actually did track a separate pool for contract employees. So we did want to make sure that we had that, because we were allowed for a project, a couple of projects, to actually charge them. And then again, the line level approvals, if you want to do it that way. And I also put down that the timesheet cycles need to match the contract employee invoice cycles. And this is really important, because when we had like agencies, for instance, we would have them say, okay, well, I bill on a weekly basis, and so I want to see timesheets on a weekly basis. So we accommodated some of them, where we would do, instead of just doing a semi-monthly, we would actually do it on a weekly basis for them, so that we didn't pay the employees on a weekly basis, but we paid the employees on a bi-weekly basis. And so you need to make sure that those are set up properly. And then again, the separate batch processing, make sure that you create and select the contract employee timesheet period, class, and group, so that when you're doing your exports, you're not commingling them with anybody else, and it allows for, it's easier for them to track in cost point. Okay. Let's see, and this is the export timesheet. I'm just basically showing you that I have on the row in front, the timesheet period shows a weekly, and then it also shows a CE for contract employees. So creating a separate timesheet schedule, class, and group can help you make sure that you're selecting the right one. And as you notice from here, they actually have a different a period, because again, the contract employees are getting paid at a different on a different basis, whereas the employees we're getting paid up to that date. Okay, and I showed the different classes and groups. Okay, so here are some of the other setup screens that you would have to look into in time collection: the employee group types, the employee groups, security roles, and of course the security roles show the rights that they have to each of the screens, and you want to make sure that you lock those down. And then here's the functional role, and as you see that there was a separate one for the contract employees, and also for the subs, if you have one, you can do the same, even though it doesn't really, from what I've seen, I've never come across where they've needed to have a separate functional role for the subs versus the contract employees. And then the last screen that I have for you is the timesheet class. And the timesheet classes, are the things that allow the various different rules, as well as the different pay types that you would use, and different notifications. And the notifications are important because not all contract employees are going to be working full-time, especially for a CRO. They would fly out and go do different drug studies here, there, or wherever. And when they were doing those studies, they may work a week a month, or they may work 2 weeks a month or something. So you don't really want them to be notified that they're late in doing their timesheet and the daily floor check, so on and so forth. And so now I'm going to get into the process and reconciliation of this new system that we've actually set up. Okay, so the process, because we separated the contract employees from the regular employees, I have on here, verify that all missing contract employees do not require timesheets for the pay cycle. Now, as you know, if you have 100, 200 contract employees, whatever, you may get a lot of missing timesheets. And so that's the reason why I put the missing in quotes, because what we did was we also had the recruiters or the project managers actually run that process to make sure that they didn't notice anybody who was missing. The strange thing was the billers actually had a lot of insight if somebody was missing a timesheet or not. Usually if someone had actually, they would check it every couple of days and make sure that before every pay period that they were seeing some timesheet activity for the contract employees before the period was over. So they usually were proactive and made sure that that people were getting their timesheets done on a timely basis. And then also to make sure that all the timesheets are properly signed and approved. And then you create, again, the business rules around the contract employees for GL accounts, for submission requirements, for their timesheets, when a timesheet is late, what you're going to do with that, and the different pay dates of when you actually want them paid. And then once you do import them into CostPoint or GCS, like I said, I created a journal entry to move the accrued salaries from accrued salaries account to a accrued contract employees account. That again made it a lot easier to reconcile. And again, as I said before, I know some companies will actually go into, once they export the timesheets, they either have a stored procedure or they will go in and manually use an offset code to move it from the one account to zero out the timesheet and to actually put the liability in the other account. So for instance, if you have 40 hours and it's, let's say they get paid $100 an hour and it's $4,000, they would have a timesheet with a positive $4,000 on it. They would put a negative line for $4,000 going to the accrued contract employees account. And then that way, when it went through labor distribution, it didn't actually post anything to the accrued salaries account. But I have found a lot of people being successful with just doing the journal entry of having that go directly into the one account and then just transferring the cost in there, because you can run different reports, especially if you have the Cognos CER tool. You can run reports to know exactly what hit labor for these people, and you can actually see the dollar amounts, and you would know what your balances are for there. And like I said, normally everybody would be paid whatever was in their on their salary info screen, and it would be just like an employee who comes to you and says, wait a minute, I was supposed to get a raise or this or that or whatever, and then of course you just make an adjustment then. But it eliminates a zero timesheet by doing the journal entry, and it helps isolate the labor cost. And again, when the invoices come in, if you do it that way, I'm going to give you some options for that. If you do it that way where they still put in an invoice, that would help. The payments would just be charged to that accrued contract employees account instead of having to go through a lot of different steps. Okay, and so here is basically me showing you a screenshot of the accrued salaries account where you are locked into that one account. Okay, so now I get into the fun part, which was the reconciliation. Especially the accountants would say, wait a minute, this is going to be a big mess. How am I going to know that I'm tracking everybody, and what if I have some money left over and whatever? And so that's the thing that I was concerned with in the very beginning, was making sure that the reconciliation was a lot streamlined and a lot easier. With employees, it was a slam dunk because we basically paid everybody up to the date that they worked, and we used the auto adjust feature, so we didn't really have to worry about that part. But we need to track contract employees against labor reports to make sure that everything looked right. We made sure that the invoices agreed with the labor cost, and if there were any discrepancies, here's a list of things that we actually did. So if there were discrepancies with the timesheets and the invoice, we verified the hourly salary was correct in CostPoint, which could be the major issue. The invoice came in at a higher amount or even a lower amount. We also, so it could be either the hourly rate was different or the amount of hours were different, because they could have typed in 100 hours or for that period, or 80 hours for that period, and submitted an invoice for a different amount of hours. We also verified that the overtime was at the correct method. So if they got paid straight time for any overtime or overtime pay rates. We wanted to make sure, because again, we were listing them as an hourly employee. So we wanted to make sure that their timesheets didn't put them into overtime or something if that was the case. Some people did get paid overtime, and they got paid overtime hours really at this the straight time rate. And then also verify if the labor costs were exported and processed, because that could be another thing where there could have been an issue where somebody either made a correcting timesheet, they had a late timesheet, and so it wasn't in there. And so we put in the invoice. So there was an invoice that was paid to them, yet they didn't actually have a timesheet yet. So you wanted to make sure that there wasn't a late timesheet. And it may include multiple periods or different cycles, which again, in bold, I have down there, timesheet cycles should match invoice cycles, because that could also be the big issue. And so again, I mean, just by the nature of how the system works, you would know that if somebody is, again, getting paid through an agency on a weekly basis, and we're paying them on a bi-weekly basis, you would know that the timesheets the time cycle should always match the invoice cycles, and make sure that you switch them to the proper cycle. Because sometimes somebody may be on their own, and then all of a sudden they go through another, which I've seen, another organization or something, where now they're going directly through an agency. Didn't make sense to me, but I've seen things happen. So you want to make sure that that is correct as well. Okay. Now the payment options. And one of the issues, or some of the many issues, is how do I pay these guys now that I do it? Do I pay them through AP? You know, how do I actually deal with that? And so with the payment options, we always required invoices from the vendors or the contract employees. It was a second way of doing it. So we would verify the invoice amounts, like I said, against the labor cost, and then we would enter it against that account. So we would pay them directly through AP by keying in that invoice. The other thing is to create vouchers from the timesheets. Now, this is something that I have heard about. I haven't seen it in action, but I understand that there is a stored procedure that will actually, as a timesheet is exported, it could create an automatic voucher. And that way, for the contract employees, it will push it will take the labor cost, charge it to the clearing account, and then you all automatically have a voucher in there. And one of the things that I probably breeze by is, with the contract employees, I set up a separate accounts payable group for them. That way I knew that they weren't going to be paid, if they were paid through AP, they weren't going to be paid until that process was supposed to happen, or that cycle was supposed to happen. So for instance, you would have your accounts payable operating, and then you would, which would be your general one, and then you would set up a different group for the contract employees. Now, if you have people who are on different cycles, like I was saying, on a weekly, or they get paid bi-weekly, you could also create that separate group. So when you set up the vendor, you're going to assign them to the proper cycle, the proper accounts payable group. So there is the contract employee with the appropriate vendor number. And then the other thing was, which was the third option, and the one that we went through, is the third-party payroll. We actually were using Ceridian for the employees' payroll. And I contacted Ceridian and said, hey, is it possible for you also to take a feed and be able to pay our contract employees where they're getting 1099s? And they said yes. And as you see here, we were actually, this thing was set up over 8 years ago. It's in the 9th year, and they're still doing it this way. They're not using Ceridian anymore, but they are using a different company. The other thing that you could do is with ADP, you could actually, because they're coming into labor distribution, you could set up a separate ADP feed, and then you could pay them directly through ADP. I don't know, because I haven't used ADP for 1099s, but there are companies out there that do that. So that may be an option. So here's a screenshot of the vendor to make sure, just to show you, here's my contract employee information, and make sure that I have the proper vendor number in there. And I said in the previous screenshot to make sure that you have that. And then here's the screenshot from T&E where it's asking for the vendor ID. And as you know, I always had the vendor ID. Now with this screenshot, the employee information screenshot in time and expense or tests, what they do is if you seat them in expense, it's going to require a vendor ID. But I always put a vendor ID even if I didn't give them a seat in expense, so that I would have that information there just in case. Like I said, if you have the ability to use the stored procedure, then that's going to help with that process. And then now we're going to be talking a little bit about the costs versus benefits. And what I did was I basically didn't, unfortunately, because it was over 8 years ago, I wasn't able to give you a lot of dollar amounts versus some basics. Here so you have to weigh your choices to determine what's best for your organization, because if you only have 5 or 10 contract employees, is it really going to be worth going through this process, setting up all these things? I mean, I know the setup would be set up one time only. But is it going to be worth it if you have less than 20 contract employees? And what I found with other people that I've spoke with, especially at the conference, 20 employees is probably the number to use before you decide to go into this method. And then for using time collection, you have the costs that you have to think about. You have the additional seats, and you have the additional annual maintenance fees for time collection. But the benefits of that is you have the less coding errors. It's easier to track. The level of effort is reduced from keying because you have less FTEs going in there and keying all this information into AP. You have the accurate timekeeping, approvals, and billing. And so therefore, it makes it a lot easier if you have this information, especially if you're going to bypass the AP side, where you would typically, some organizations will still require approvals. And especially if they use workflow systems for the approvals and cost point by using either Docs for Deltek or some other workflow system. Yeah, it's one less process that you have to go through with that as well. But and then like I said, you can create the automatic payments for both the vouchers and the payroll, which would help out as well. But the key thing is with the benefits is the accuracy. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have actually had the issue with billing and then finding out that the billing was incorrect. The hours may have been wrong or something else happened, and that helps reduce a lot of that, especially if a contract employee submits an invoice or their agency submits an invoice for more money. That stuff will be noticed in the reconciliation, but the billing will be accurate. And then for not using time collection, the costs were the additional FTEs, depending on the volume of the contract employees. Again, if you have less than 20, it's probably not worth it. And the potential for the incorrect customer billings, as well as the delays in payments. So a delay in billing is obviously going to be a delay in your payment, which is going to have an impact on your cash flow. And the benefits is only if additional FTEs, the cost is going to be less than the additional licenses or maintenance. And so basically, the part where I ask if you have any questions. Okay. Here's contact information for me. I work for CRI, and you can reach me by my number right there, or you can reach me through my email address, fcost@cri4results.com. If you have any questions, like I said, I did this presentation at the Deltec conference, and quite a few people came up to me and talked to me afterwards asking for additional information. And so it's just one of those things where, if you're doing this process, you feel like there's ways of improvement, or if you're, thinking about doing this process, feel free to give me a call, go to our website, and contact us that way. But other than that, if there aren't any questions, then I appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something.